When we close our eyes and think of Rome, we see the gold. We see the white marble of the Senate. We see the red cloaks of the Praetorian Guard. We see the glory. And at the center of that glory is the triumph, the ultimate Roman ceremony. A general painted in red lead to look like the god Jupiter, riding a chariot through the cheering streets, followed by the spoils of war, gold, silver, exotic animals, and people. But history is a trick of the light. It focuses on the man in the chariot. It rarely focuses on the figure walking behind him. Imagine for a moment that you are not a Roman citizen cheering in the crowd. Imagine you are the woman walking in the dust behind the wheels. Days ago, you were a queen. You commanded armies. You sat on a throne of ivory or gold. Your word was law. You were considered a goddess on earth. Now, you are bound in chains so heavy you can barely stand. You are naked or dressed in rags that mock your former station. You are covered in the spit of the mob. The history books tell us that the triumph was the end of the war, but for the captured queens of antiquity, for women like Arsinoe, Zenobia, and the daughters of Cleopatra, the triumph was not the end, it was the climax of a torture that had lasted for months. What happened in the dark time between the capture and the parade? What happened on the ships? What happened in the damp, freezing darkness of the Tullianum dungeon? The Roman soldier was disciplined in battle, but he was a monster in victory, and the rights he claimed over the body of a royal captive were absolute. To humiliate a queen was to humiliate her nation. To break her body was to break her people's spirit. This is the story of the women who fell from Olympus into the gutter of Rome. This is the story of what they endured before the crowds ever saw them, a fate that historians whispered was truly worse than death. To understand the specific hell of a captured queen, we must understand the height from which she falls. In the ancient world, a queen was not just a political leader. In Egypt, she was Isis on earth. In the East, she was the mother of the world. She was surrounded by eunuchs, handmaidens, and guards who would die for her. She lived in a world of perfume, silk, and absolute sanctity. To touch the queen was death. And then the legion arrives. The capture of a royal city, be it Alexandria, Palmyra, or Syracuse, followed a brutal script. The Roman battering rams shatter the gates. The discipline of the legion holds for the battle, but once the enemy breaks, the sack begins. For the queen hiding in her palace, the sound of the sack is the sound of her world ending. It is the sound of sandals on marble getting closer, the screams of her guards dying, the crashing of doors. When the Roman soldiers enter the throne room, the sanctity is shattered. The first thing they do is strip away the symbols of power. The crown is snatched, the jewelry is ripped from the neck and wrists, often tearing the skin. But the true violence is the stripping of the aura of royalty. A common soldier, a man who grew up on a farm in Italy, suddenly has his hands on a woman he was taught to view as a living deity. The psychological rush of this power is intoxicating. He does not see a woman, he sees a trophy. He sees a bonus payment. In these initial hours, before the general arrives to claim the high-value prisoners, the queen is at the mercy of the vanguard. History is often silent on the specifics, but the subtext is clear. The despoiling of the royal household was considered a perk of the victory. The queen is dragged by her hair from the throne. She is forced to watch the execution of her advisors, her priests, and often her children. Rome wanted to ensure that no heir would rise to challenge them. So the first act of the captive queen's new life was often to stand in the blood of her family.
Once the initial chaos subsides, the cold bureaucracy of Rome takes over. A queen cannot simply be killed. She is too valuable. She is the centerpiece of the coming triumph. She must be kept alive. But alive does not mean unharmed. The Roman general, be it Caesar, Pompey, or Aurelian, orders the queen to be secured. This marks the beginning of the Via Dolorosa, the road of sorrow. The journey to Rome could take months. From the sands of Syria or the banks of the Nile, the captive queen had to travel thousands of miles. She did not travel in a carriage. She was often placed in a cage, a wooden or iron cage mounted on a cart. Why? Because she was an exhibit. As the legion marched back toward Italy, they passed through towns and provinces. The general needed to show the people that he had won. The queen in the cage was his proof. Imagine the degradation. A woman accustomed to bathing in milk and rosewater is now locked in a cage like a wild beast. She has no privacy. She relieves herself where she sits. She is covered in dust and filth. Soldiers guard the cage day and night. They poke her with spears to make her stand up. They throw food at her through the bars. They mock her in Latin, a language she might not understand, though the tone of hatred is universal. At night, the camp is set. The cage is placed near the general's tent, but not inside it. The soldiers drink wine, they gamble, and they look at the cage. While high-profile queens like Zenobia might have been protected from direct sexual assault by the strict orders of an emperor who wanted her pristine for the parade, the threat was constant. The soldiers would describe in graphic detail what they would do to her once the triumph was over. This is psychological siege warfare. The goal is to break her mind, to make her docile, to make her realize that her body is no longer divine property, it is Roman property. For queens captured in the East or Africa, the journey involved crossing the Mediterranean. The Roman trireme is a cramped, smelling vessel of war. The queen is taken below decks. She is not given a cabin. She is chained in the hold, often near the ballast. The hold of a ship is a sensory nightmare. It is pitch black. It smells of bilge water, unwashed rowers, and vomit. The rats run over her feet. The seasickness is constant. For a woman like Arsinoe IV, the sister of Cleopatra, who was dragged to Rome by Julius Caesar, this voyage was a descent into the underworld. In the dark, the distinction between day and night vanishes. The queen sits in her chains, listening to the groans of other captives, her former handmaidens, her generals. There is a specific cruelty in this isolation. Rome wanted the queen to ruminate, to think about her fall. They wanted her to arrive in Rome not with a fire in her eyes, but with a hollow stare. They wanted a broken doll, not a defiant monarch.
During the voyage, the inspection would occur. The Roman officers would come down to the hold to check on their cargo. They would inspect the queen's health, not out of compassion, but out of greed. If she died, the triumph would be ruined. They would force feed her if she refused to eat. They would wash her with seawater. They treated her exactly as they would treat a prize lion or a rare elephant. She was an exotic beast being transported for the circus. Finally, the ship docks at Ostia. The cart rumbles up the Via Appia. The queen sees the walls of Rome. To a Roman, these walls meant safety. To the queen, they were the teeth of the monster that had swallowed her whole. She is not taken to a palace. She is taken to the carcer, the prison, specifically the Tullianum. We must pause to describe the Tullianum, for it is one of the most terrifying places on earth. It was a dungeon located at the foot of the Capitoline Hill.
It was not a jail designed for long sentences. It was a waiting room for death. The Tullianum was a hole in the ground, a damp subterranean chamber that smelled of centuries of misery. It was connected to the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome. The floor was covered in mud and excrement. There was no light. The queen, who slept on silk, is lowered into this pit. She is chained to the wall. The iron cuffs bite into her wrists. She is left there, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. She waits for the triumph. In the darkness of the Tullianum, time loses meaning. She is visited only by the executioner, who brings her meager rations of bread and water. He might tell her the date of the parade. He might taunt her with details of her coming execution. Strangulation, he might whisper, or perhaps starvation. This period, the waiting, was the worse than death. It was the total stripping of humanity. A queen in the Tullianum was lower than a beggar on the street. She was buried alive. Many captives went mad in this darkness. Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, was thrown into this pit and famously cried out, "By Hercules, your bath is cold," before dying of starvation. For a woman, the vulnerability was absolute. In the dark, any guard could enter. Any guard could take what he wanted. And who would she tell? The rats? The day of the triumph arrives. The door to the dungeon opens. The light hurts her eyes. She is dragged out, blinking, into the Roman sun. She is filthy, emaciated, covered in sores. But Rome does not want to show the mob a wretched beggar. Rome wants to show a conquered queen. So the preparation begins. This is a grotesque mockery of the royal toilette. Roman matrons or female slaves are brought in to dress her. They wash off the filth of the dungeon. They scent her with perfumes. But they do not dress her in Roman clothes. They dress her in the regalia of her former power. They put the heavy gold crown back on her head. They drape her in robes of purple and gold. They load her with jewelry, pearls, emeralds, rubies. This is not to make her look beautiful. It is to make her look heavy. The weight of the gold is a physical torture. For a woman weakened by months of starvation, carrying 50 pounds of gold is agony.
She is given a placard to hold, or one is carried before her. Zenobia, Queen of the East. Arsinoe, sister of the Pharaoh. She is labeled like a jar of wine. The trumpets sound. The procession begins. The noise is physical. A wall of sound hits her. Rome had a population of 1 million. It seemed like every single one of them was on the street. The queen is forced to walk. She is not walking on pavement. She is walking on flowers thrown by the crowd, but also on rot and filth. She is walking behind the chariot of the general. The general stands tall, the hero. She is the punchline to his joke. The crowd in Rome was cruel. They did not feel pity. They felt schadenfreude, joy in the suffering of others. They would mock her body. They would scream obscenities. They would throw things, rotten fruit, stones. She cannot shield herself. Her hands are chained. She must walk head up while the city laughs at her destruction. If she stumbles, the soldiers whip her, not a heavy whip to kill, but a light switch to sting, to keep her moving. Walk, Queen, walk! She passes the temples. She passes the Senate. She sees the civilized men of Rome, the senators in their togas, watching her with cold, analytical eyes. They are calculating the value of her kingdom. They are not seeing a human. They are seeing a new province. And in the crowd, she might see her own children. This was the ultimate cruelty. If the queen had children, they were often forced to walk with her. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra, walked in the triumph of Augustus. She was a child. Imagine the pain of a mother. She is humiliated, but her eyes are fixed on her terrified children walking beside her. She knows that their lives are in the balance. If she weeps, if she collapses, the soldiers might hurt them. So she walks. She endures the worse than death to buy one more day of life for her offspring. The procession winds its way up the Capitoline Hill to the Temple of Jupiter. This is the end of the road. The general goes to the temple to sacrifice a white bull to the god. But what happens to the queen? This is the moment of the selection. The triumph had a tradition. At the foot of the hill, the leader of the enemy was usually taken aside. While the general went up to the light, the captive went down into the dark. Historically, male kings like Vercingetorix were taken to the Tullianum and strangled immediately. But for women, the fate was more ambiguous and often more lingering. The Roman soldier, the Roman mob, and the Roman Senate had to decide, is she worth more dead or alive? If she was considered too dangerous to live, a rallying point for rebels, she would be strangled in the dark, quietly while the city celebrated above. But if she was considered a trophy, her life was spared. But what kind of life? She would not be released, she would not go home, she would be given to a Roman aristocrat. She would be moved from the dungeon to a villa in Tibur or the countryside. She would become a house pet, a curiosity. "Come to dinner," the Roman senator would say to his guests. "I want to show you the Queen of the East." She would be brought out at parties, forced to recount her defeat, forced to entertain the wives of her conquerors. She would live in comfort, yes, but she would live in a state of permanent exhibition. She was a living museum piece. She would watch her children grow up as Romans, speaking Latin, forgetting their mother tongue, forgetting the gods of their ancestors. She would die in a foreign bed, staring at a foreign sky, knowing that her name, her dynasty, and her history had been swallowed by the wolf of Rome.
This was the slow death, the death of identity, the death of the soul. And for a queen who once ruled the world, this silent, comfortable oblivion was indeed worse than death. Let us move from the general to the specific. Let us look at the face of a teenage girl standing in the dust of Rome. Her name is Arsinoe IV. You know her sister well. Her sister is Cleopatra, the most famous woman in history. But history has forgotten Arsinoe, and Rome made sure of it. The year is 46 BC. Julius Caesar has returned to Rome to celebrate his quadruple triumph. The city is in a frenzy. The loot from Gaul, Pontus, Africa, and Egypt is pouring into the capital. But among the gold and the ivory, there is a girl. She is barely 20 years old. Arsinoe had dared to challenge Caesar. She had declared herself Queen of Egypt while Cleopatra slept in Caesar's bed. She had fought for her country's independence. And for this crime, she was dragged to Rome. Imagine the specific horror of her position. She is not just a captured enemy, she is the sister of the woman currently living in Caesar's villa. Cleopatra is in Rome, watching. Arsinoe is in chains, walking. The chroniclers tell us something extraordinary about this specific triumph. Usually, the Roman mob loved to see royalty humbled. They cheered when Vercingetorix was strangled. But when they saw Arsinoe, the cheering stopped. Why? Because she was a child. She was bound in heavy chains that dragged in the dirt. Her hands were blistered. She was weeping, not the dignified tears of a queen, but the terrified sobbing of a young girl who knows she is going to die. The sight was so pathetic, so visibly cruel, that a murmur of pity went through the crowd. "Look," they whispered, "she is but a girl."
Caesar, the master politician, realized he had made a mistake. He had pushed the cruelty too far. The theater of shame was becoming a theater of sympathy. So he spared her life. But what is mercy in Rome? He banished her to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, modern-day Turkey. She was locked away in the sanctuary. For years she lived in the shadow of the goddess, constantly looking over her shoulder. She knew her sister Cleopatra. She knew that as long as she breathed, she was a threat. And she was right. Years later, when Mark Antony fell under the spell of Cleopatra, the order was given. Roman soldiers violated the sanctuary of the temple, a crime against the gods. They dragged Arsinoe out onto the steps. There was no parade this time, no golden chains, just a sword in the sunlight. The sister of the pharaoh was eliminated like a common criminal, her body left on the marble steps. Her triumph in Rome had been a slow death. Her end in Ephesus was merely the final punctuation mark of a life lived in fear. Fast forward 300 years. The year is 274 AD. Rome is under the Emperor Aurelian, the restorer of the world. He has reconquered the East from the Palmyrene Empire, and his prize is the warrior queen, Zenobia. Zenobia is not like Arsinoe. She is not a scared child. She is a legend. She claimed descent from Cleopatra. She rode with her cavalry. She drank with her generals. She created an empire that rivaled Rome. When she was captured at the banks of the Euphrates, she didn't beg. But Rome has a way of breaking even the strongest iron.
The humiliation of Zenobia began before she even reached the city. It began with the trial in Emesa. Aurelian put her on trial for rebellion. The pressure was immense. The soldiers clamored for her execution. And here, the history books tell us a dark secret. Zenobia broke. Under the threat of torture, this warrior queen blamed her advisors. She pointed the finger at the philosopher Longinus. "It was not me," she reportedly said. "It was bad advice from men." Aurelian executed the philosopher. He spared the queen. Why? Because he needed her for the show. The triumph of Aurelian was one of the most spectacular in history. The loot included the chariot of the king of the Goths and the jewels of the East, but the centerpiece was Zenobia. The chroniclers go into obsessive detail about her appearance that day. She was not naked. She was dressed in the full imperial regalia of the East. But the jewelry, it was weaponized. She was draped in so many pearls, so many gems, and bound with chains of such heavy gold that she physically could not walk. A queen who had ridden war horses into battle was now crushed under the weight of her own wealth. She required a supporter, a Persian slave or a Roman buffoon, to walk beside her and hold up the chains so she wouldn't collapse face first into the mud. This was a calculated engineering of humiliation. Aurelian was saying, "Look at her wealth. It is a burden, not a power. Rome is strong enough to carry it. She is not." The crowd went wild. They screamed at her. They called her an Eastern sorceress. She had to walk miles in the heat, sweating under layers of purple silk and gold, listening to the death of her reputation. Every step was a penance. Every step destroyed the legend of the warrior queen and replaced it with the image of the stumbling slave. What happened to Zenobia when the sun went down? Unlike Vercingetorix, she was not strangled. Aurelian gave her a villa in Tibur, near the famous Hadrian's villa. This sounds like a happy ending, a retirement. But look closer. Zenobia was a woman of intellect and action. She ruled an empire. Now she was a Roman matron. She was forced to marry a Roman senator, according to some accounts, or simply live as a high-status widow. She became a curiosity for the Roman elite. Senators would visit her. "Tell us about the desert," they would ask, sipping their wine.
tell us what it was like to fight Rome. She was forced to perform her past for the amusement of her captors. She had to adopt Roman dress. She had to speak Latin. Her children were raised as Romans, completely assimilated into the system that destroyed her mother's legacy. She lived for years, but it was a hollow life. She was the tiger in the cage, fed well, groomed, and kept behind bars for the guests to gawk at. In some ways, this was the ultimate Roman victory. They didn't just kill her body, they domesticated her spirit. They turned a wolf into a house cat. Not every queen allowed herself to be taken to Rome. Some knew the script. They knew about the cage, the chains, the mob, and they chose the exit. Let us speak of Sophonisba. She was a Carthaginian noblewoman during the Second Punic War. She was married to Syphax, a king allied with Carthage, but she was captured by Massinissa, a king allied with Rome. Massinissa loved her. He wanted to marry her, but Scipio Africanus, the Roman general, demanded she be handed over. She is the property of the Roman people. She belongs in the triumph.
Sophonisba knew what that meant. She looked at Massinissa and said she would rather die than be paraded in Rome behind a chariot. Massinissa, in a final act of twisted love, sent her a cup of poison. "If this is the only wedding gift I can give you," he said, "then take it." Sophonisba drank the poison without hesitation. Her last words were a rebuke to Rome. "I would have died better if I had not married at my funeral." She denied Rome its show. When Scipio found out, he was furious, not because a woman had died, but because a prop had been broken. He had lost his centerfold for the parade. This story highlights the cold reality. To Rome, a live queen was a toy. A dead queen was a waste. Sophonisba's suicide was the only power she had left, the power to say no. It was not just the queens of the East who suffered. The women of the North, the Germanic tribes, faced a different kind of horror. The Romans viewed the Germans as giants, as beasts. When Germanicus campaigned in the north to avenge the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, he captured visionaries and noblewomen like Thunelda. Thunelda was the wife of Arminius, the man who destroyed 3 Roman legions. She was pregnant when she was captured. Imagine her triumph. She walks in Rome, holding her toddler son, Thumilicus. Her father, Segestes, who had betrayed her to the Romans, stood on the viewing stand watching his own daughter parade in chains. The humiliation was multi-generational. Her son, Thumilicus, born in captivity, was raised as a gladiator. Think of the cruelty. The grandson of a Germanic king raised to die in the sand for the amusement of the mob. Thunelda had to live to see this. She had to watch her bloodline transformed into circus entertainment. But there were others who refused this fate. Historical accounts from the Cimbrian War tell of Germanic women who, when they saw the battle was lost, did not surrender. They stood by their wagons dressed in black. When the Romans approached to take them, they killed their children first. They strangled them or threw them under the wheels of the wagons. Then they killed themselves. The Romans wrote about this with horror. They called it barbaric madness. But looking back, we see it differently. These women knew what happened in the Roman camps. They knew what happened in the slave markets. They looked at their daughters and decided that death, sharp, bloody, and immediate, was a mercy compared to the slow, grinding death of Roman slavery. They saved their children from the worse than death by giving them death itself. We must address the elephant in the room, the aspect of captivity that Victorian historians refused to write about, the sexual entitlement of the conqueror. In Roman law, a captive had no sexual autonomy. For a queen, this was a specific tool of degradation. While high-profile queens like Zenobia might be kept pure for the parade, a damaged trophy is less impressive,
Their daughters, handmaidens, and sisters were fair game. The Roman concept of stuprum, illicit sexual acts, only applied to Roman citizens. Violating a captive queen or princess was not a crime. It was an assertion of dominance. I have conquered your land, and now I conquer your bloodline. There are whispers in the histories of marriages forced upon captured royalty. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, the sons of Cleopatra, disappear from history, but Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, is married off to Juba II, a client king. This sounds like a diplomatic arrangement, but look closer. She is given to a man loyal to Rome. She is used as a breed mare to produce loyal client kings in North Africa. Her womb is colonized. Her lineage is hijacked to serve the empire that killed her mother.
This biological warfare was the final phase of the conquest. Rome didn't just want the land. They wanted to breed the resistance out of the royal families. They wanted the next generation of kings to have Roman manners, Roman loyalty, and a Roman father figures. We have spoken of the body, we have spoken of the gold, but we must now speak of the soul. For a queen in the ancient world, her power was not just political, it was divine. In Egypt, the queen was the vessel of Isis. In the Celtic lands, she was the bridge to the spirits of the forest. In the East, she was the high priestess of the sun. When Rome captured a queen, they didn't just capture a woman, they captured a deity. And for the Roman triumph to be complete, the enemy's gods had to be shown to be weak, dead, or enslaved to Jupiter. Imagine the psychological horror of a priestess queen. She is forced to walk in the triumph not just with her own chains, but carrying the sacred idols of her people. Statues that no hand was allowed to touch, now handled by rough soldiers, spat upon by the mob, and displayed as curiosities. There is a specific cruelty recorded in the triumph of Pompey over Judea. The Holy of Holies was breached. The sacred artifacts of the temple were paraded through Rome. For a captured Jewish noblewoman or royal, seeing the menorah and the sacred vessels being mocked in the streets of a pagan city was a spiritual death. It was the confirmation that heaven had abandoned them. Rome weaponized religion. They forced captive queens to bow before the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus at the end of the parade. Think of what this means. You are forced to kneel before the God of the men who destroyed your home. You are forced to acknowledge that your gods were weak and their God is strong. This was the soul-breaking. It ensured that even if the queen survived, she would never again have the spiritual authority to lead her people. She was polluted. She was forsaken. If there is a hell deeper than the Tullianum, it is the hell of a mother watching her children destroyed by the very system that enslaved her. The Romans were obsessed with lineage. They knew that a king's son grows up to be an avenger. So they had two methods of dealing with the children of captured queens. Method 1, the erasure. This was the fate of the sons of Cleopatra. Caesarion, her son with Caesar, hunted down and eliminated. Too many Caesars is not good, the Romans said. Antilis, her son with Mark Antony, dragged from a statue of a god and ended. For a queen, the capture often meant the immediate execution of her male heirs. She had to stand in the blood of her sons, knowing her dynasty ended with her breath. Method 2 was the perversion. This was the fate of the children of the Germanic and Gallic queens. To Melicus, the son of the Germanic hero Arminius and the captive noblewoman Thusnelda, was born in captivity. He did not grow up in the forests of Germania. He grew up in Ravenna, Italy. And what did Rome do with the son of their greatest enemy? They trained him to be a gladiator. Imagine the mother's agony. Thusnelda, a woman of nobility and pride, watching her son being trained to entertain the Roman mob. He was not trained to be a warrior leader. He was trained to be a spectacle, to die in the sand for the applause of the people who enslaved her mother. History tells us Tumellus died young in the arena. This was the ultimate Roman joke. Your father destroyed 3 legions. Now his son dies for our amusement.
And for the daughters? Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra, was paraded in the triumph at age 10. She survived, but she was married off to King Juba II of Mauritania, another Roman puppet. She was turned into a breeding vessel for Rome's client kings. Her royal Egyptian blood was used to legitimize a Roman-controlled province. She lived her life in a gilded cage, surrounded by Egyptian art, speaking Greek but serving Rome. She was a living museum exhibit of a dead empire. How did the women of Rome react to these captives? Did the Roman matrons, the wives of senators, the mothers of the Gracchi, feel solidarity with these fallen queens? History suggests the opposite. The Roman matron lived in a strict patriarchal society. She had rules, duties, and limitations. When she saw a queen like Zenobia or Cleopatra, she didn't see a sister. She saw a monster, a woman who ruled, a woman who led armies, a woman who took lovers as she pleased. To the Roman mind, this was unnatural. It was dangerous. The captive queens were often subjected to the scorn of Rome's elite women. We have accounts of Roman ladies visiting the captive royals to gawk at them, to touch their clothes, to mock their accents. It was a way for Roman women to assert their own superiority. You may have been a queen, their eyes said, but I am a Roman citizen, and you are nothing. There was also jealousy. When Julius Caesar brought Cleopatra to Rome before her fall, the Roman women hated her. She was too beautiful, too intelligent, too free. When Arsinoe was dragged in chains, the pity of the mob was mixed with a sense of relief. The dangerous woman had been tamed. The captive queen became a morality play for Roman daughters. Look what happens when a woman tries to act like a man. She ends up in chains. We focus on the famous names, but what of the hundreds of lesser royals, the princesses of Thrace, the nieces of Pontic kings, the daughters of Gallic chieftains? They were too numerous to be kept in villas. Their fate was the luxury market. Rome had a specific market for high-end slaves. These women were not sold on the common block in the Forum. They were sold in private auctions in the Saepta Julia or the gardens of the wealthy. A princess from the East, educated in Greek, skilled in the lyre, was the ultimate status symbol for a corrupt Roman billionaire. She would be bought for an astronomical sum, sometimes 200,000 sestertii. She would become the delicacy of her master. Unlike a common slave, she would be dressed in silk. She would be given her own room. She would be expected to converse on poetry and art. But she was still a slave. Her body was the property of her master. If he wanted her, she had to submit. If he wanted to lend her to his friends for a night, she had to go. This was a fate of soft horror. There were no whips, there were no dungeons, there was wine, soft beds and baths, but it was a life of total prostitution, masked as companionship. She was a living statue, bought to make a rich man feel like a king. And if she got pregnant, the child was a slave. If she grew old and lost her beauty, she was discarded, sent to the kitchens, or sold to a lower bidder. The descent from princess to old servant was a slow, agonizing slide into invisibility. The final punishment Rome inflicted was damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. For a queen, immortality is her legacy, her name written on monuments, her face on coins, her story told by bards.
Rome smashed the monuments.
They melted the coins. When Zenobia was captured, Palmyra was destroyed. The city that rivaled Rome was turned into a ghost town. The Library of Alexandria was burned in stages over centuries, taking with it the records of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Rome rewrote the history books. In Roman history, Cleopatra became a drunk whore. Zenobia became a confused woman led astray by men. Boudica became a savage animal. They stripped these women of their agency, their intelligence, and their dignity. They turned complex political leaders into caricatures of female hysteria. The captive queen was forced to live in a world where her truth was being erased in real time. She had to listen to Roman poets recite lies about her life. She had to watch plays where actors mocked her tragedy. She became a character in someone else's fiction. This is the ultimate victory of the conqueror. Not only do I own your body, not only do I own your land, I own your story. And for a queen who lived for her legacy, this erasure was the final nail in the coffin. Let us return to the villa in Tibur, where Zenobia supposedly lived out her days. Imagine the twilight years of a warrior queen. She sits in a Roman garden. The fountains ripple, the olive trees cast long shadows. She is safe, she is fed, she is Roman. But at night, does she dream of the desert? Does she hear the thunder of the Palomarine heavy cavalry? Does she feel the weight of the crown? Or has the trauma of the cage, the chains, and the mob scrubbed her mind clean? There are no records of Zenobia's old age. She simply vanishes from the text. This silence is the loudest sound of all. It means she ceased to matter to Rome. She became just another old woman in a villa, perhaps telling stories to grandchildren who didn't understand the language of her heart. The captive queens died twice. First, on the day of the triumph, when their spirit was broken before the mob, and second, on the day they took their last breath, forgotten by the world they once ruled. We cannot speak of Rome's treatment of royal women without traveling north to the mist-covered island of Britannia. Here, the rules of civilized captivity broke down completely. In the East, Rome treated queens like Zenobia with a cold, performative cruelty. In the North, they treated queens like animals. The story of Boudica is well known, but we must focus on the catalyst of her rage. Boudica was the queen of the Iceni. When her husband died, he left half his kingdom to Rome, hoping to buy safety for his family. Rome's response was not gratitude, it was total domination. They didn't just annex the land, they decided to break the royal line immediately. Boudica was publicly flogged, a queen stripped and whipped like a common thief in front of her people. But the fate of her daughters was the true Roman weapon. History records that the Roman soldiers violated the young princesses. This was not random lust, this was a calculated political act. By defiling the virgins of the royal line, Rome ensured they could never marry high-ranking Celtic chieftains. They destroyed their value in the marriage market. They destroyed the dynasty's future. This atrocity tells us everything we need to know about the Roman mindset. To them, a barbarian queen had no rights. Her body was a battlefield. Boudica's subsequent revolt, burning London to the ground, was not just a war for territory. It was the scream of a mother trying to wash away the shame of her daughters with Roman blood. Boudica took poison rather than be captured. Why? Because she knew what waited for her. She knew about the cage. She knew about the triumph. And she decided that death in a bog was infinite mercy compared to life in Rome. This brings us to the dark phenomenon of the royal suicide.
History often romanticizes these deaths. We see Cleopatra with the asp. We see Sophonisba with the poison cup. We view them as tragic, operatic moments, but we must look at them through the lens of trauma. These women did not kill themselves because they were sad. They killed themselves because they were terrified. They had intelligence networks. They knew what happened to Aristobulus. They knew what happened to Vercingetorix. They knew that Rome meant being turned into a living prop. Cleopatra's suicide is the most famous event in antiquity, but strip away the Shakespearean romance. She spent her final days barricaded in her mausoleum, negotiating with Octavian, Augustus. She tested poisons on prisoners to see which was the least painful. This is not romance. This is a desperate woman looking for a door, any door that doesn't lead to a cage. When Octavian realized she was dead, he was furious. He sent psylli, snake charmers or healers, to try and suck the poison from her veins. He didn't want to save her life. He wanted to save his parade. A dead Cleopatra was just a corpse. A live Cleopatra was a trophy. By dying, she stole his glory. It was her final victory. You can have my kingdom, but you cannot have me. For 2,000 years, artists have painted these women. Walk through the Louvre or the National Gallery. Look at the paintings of Zenobia in chains or the death of Cleopatra. What do you see? You see beautiful, voluptuous women. Their clothes are torn just enough to be sexy. Their chains look like jewelry. They look sad but dignified. This is the marble lie. Victorian and Renaissance artists fetishized the suffering of these women. They turned torture into erotica. They did not paint the dysentery. They did not paint the sores from the iron cuffs. They did not paint the starvation. They created a fantasy where a captive queen is still a glamorous figure. The reality was a smell, the smell of unwashed bodies, of fear, of infection. The reality was the sound of a woman screaming in a language no one understood. By turning these women into beautiful paintings, we have sanitized their hell. We have become like the Roman mob, staring at the spectacle, ignoring the human being. We must shatter this image. A captured queen was not a romantic figure. She was a victim of human trafficking on an imperial scale. Did any of them survive? Did the bloodline continue? Rome tried to prune the branches, but life is resilient. Zenobia's descendants reportedly lived in Rome for centuries. A Roman noble family in the 5th century claimed descent from her. The blood of the warrior queen of the East mixed with the blood of the senators who enslaved her. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra, became a queen in her own right in Mauritania. She minted coins with her mother's image, a quiet act of rebellion. Her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, was the last of the Ptolemies. He was eventually assassinated by the Emperor Caligula. Why? Because he wore a purple cloak to the gladiator games, and Caligula was jealous of his royal aura. Even 3 generations later, Rome could not tolerate a rival son. But for the vast majority, the Germanic princesses, the Dacian queens, the Gallic noblewomen, there is no trace. Their DNA is woven into the population of modern Italy, France, and Turkey. If you take a DNA test today, you might carry the markers of a woman who walked in a triumph 2,000 years ago. They are the silent ancestors, the ghosts in our blood. We come to the end of the road. We have walked from the burning palaces of the East to the cold dungeons of the Capitoline Hill. We have seen the gold and we have seen the iron. The Roman Empire is often held up as the pinnacle of civilization. We admire their laws, their roads, their concrete. But a civilization is not judged by how it treats the powerful. It is judged by how it treats the powerless. The treatment of captured queens exposes the dark heart of Rome. It was a society built on the concept of dominium, total domination. It wasn't enough to win the war. You had to humiliate the loser. You had to break their gods, enslave their children, and parade their women like cattle. The phrase "worse than death" is often used lightly, but for a woman raised to be a goddess who ends her days as a curiosity in a Roman villa, or a broken body on the steps of the temple, or a madwoman in the darkness of the Tullianum, the phrase is literal. Death is an end. Captivity in Rome was an eternity. When you look at the statues of the Caesars, do not just see the marble. See the reflection in their eyes, the reflection of the women they broke to build their glory. The invisible queens, the gilded chains, the silent scream that has lasted for 2,000 years.